Thank you for coming to our budget briefing on the enacted state budget for fiscal year 2027. My name is Emily Eisner. I am the acting executive director at the Fiscal Policy Institute. I'm joined by my colleagues Andrew Perry and Michael Knukin for today's briefing, and we're going to jump in. I think people are still joining, but we will post the slides and the video at the end of the presentation. Okay, so the final all funds budget will be $268 billion. This is 2.2% higher than the executive budget proposal, which was set at $262.7 billion. This was quite a long and drawn out budget process with a lot of policy in the mix, and we're not going to be able to talk about all of that today. Some highlights from the budget process were reforms to Tier 6, the state employee pension program. Also, one of the early accomplishments in the budget season was large expansion to childcare in the state, and a significant amount of funds that have been restored to New York City to help New York City meet its funding needs. Amongst the shortcomings of the budget, we would highlight most importantly that there's no plan to assist the 450,000 people who are going to lose essential plan coverage this coming July, in just a couple months. There's also very little in the way of planning for reductions in SNAP funding and the currently newly implemented SNAP work requirements. There's also $1 billion that will be used to pay for an energy rebate, quote unquote energy rebate. These are $100 checks being sent to over 90% of state residents. We assess this as use of money that is not efficient and not actually helping to solve the affordability crisis that is on our hands. And among the many sort of policy issues that were worked through during this budget process, there were major rollbacks to the New York climate law. So that's sort of the highlights as we see it on the fiscal side of the budget. To talk a little bit more about what we see as like a major concern and how we're thinking about going into next year's budget, I just want to remind everyone that we expect 450,000 New Yorkers to lose insurance this July and probably over 1 million to lose insurance over the coming year. That'll take us back to an uninsured rate in the state that is the pre-Affordable Care Act rate. So we're going to go below 90% of people in the state having health insurance. Similarly, in nutrition assistance or food stamps, or what's now called SNAP, we have already seen a 4% decline in SNAP enrollment in the state. That's about 100,000 New Yorkers who were on SNAP last year and now are not on SNAP. It's a slower decline than the average in the US, but it's still precipitous. So those are, failures of the state budget as we see it. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the revenue proposals and actions that are being taken at the state level, which are what allow the state to, build out its programs. There was little change between the executive budget proposals and the enacted budget. So there are two major revenue measures being taken. One is an extension of the corporate tax rates. So in 2021, the corporate tax was raised to 7.25 from 6.5% for corporations that make over $5 million a year. That's now been extended for 3 years through calendar year 2029. The state is also going to decouple from some of the provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and that will bring in $700 million annually to the state. The corporate tax extension brings in $1.3 billion annually to the state. There's also one additional measure being taken in the enacted budget. This is the Pied-à-terre tax that many of us have read about or talked about or heard about. Andrew will cover that when we talk about the New York City funding situation, but that's the other new component of revenue measures in the enacted budget. Also in the sort of revenue side of the equation, the what's called the power rebates, or these energy rebates that are intended to be alleviating to households who have faced really high energy costs over the last year. We're including this in the revenue section because that's how it's being implemented through sort of a tax refund. These are $100 one-time checks to 92% of New Yorkers. It's going to cost the state $1 billion. This is a smaller program than what was actually proposed by the Assembly. And I just want to point out that FPI assesses this to be a counterproductive and ineffective measure to address affordability policy. And this is now we've had, policies of this sort, like rebates, costing the state $1 to $2 billion every year since fiscal year 2023. This is like an established pattern now of ineffective one-off handouts that we see as a major issue in the fiscal landscape. Additionally, the executive budget proposed no tax on tips. This is extension of an OBBBA policy that excludes tipped income from New York State income taxes. We again see this as bad policy in terms of revenue. It's gonna cost the state $60 million a year, and it's also bad labor policy. It incentivizes payment in the form of tips, which is not how we'd like workers to be paid. The so-called ZIN tax also was adopted. This is a 75% tax on wholesale purchases of ZIN or nicotine products that hadn't been included in the nicotine tax previously. Again, we see this as ineffective as a revenue raiser due to tax avoidance, and it's also likely ineffective as a public health measure. I'd like to note that though there's very little action in revenue this year, we do think that next year the revenue needs will be higher, and it's worth noting that both one-house proposals included large suites of revenue actions that could be used to raise revenue and make up for cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and the Essential Plan, and could also use to do program expansion such as Childcare, which Andrew will get to in a little bit. In particular, the Senate One House demonstrated a really broad suite of revenue options. I've listed some of them here, or actually all of them, but they included a hike to personal income tax rates, an increase in the corporate tax rate, very notably a reduction in the pass-through entity tax credit to 90%, which got at least some amount of play in budget negotiations, and a few other measures that were smaller. We want to emphasize these as we go into next year because we see the raising new revenue as key to sort of meeting states' programmatic needs. This is in many ways what I just said. We continue to have recommendations, many of which mirror what the Senate One House proposed. The additional pieces that maybe didn't make the Senate One House are taxation of net controlled foreign corporation tested income. This is the last bullet point on this list, and a capital gains surtax. So we have a few more options that could be considered by the legislature and the governor if they so choose. Okay. As I said, one of the accomplishments of the budget that we applaud is reforms to Tier 6. I will just briefly go over those. As background, public employees in the state saw reductions to their benefits in 2012. Actually, there was a series of reductions starting in 2009, all of this in the wake of the Great Recession. Those reforms at that time created new tiers to the employee pension system, and there were increased contribution rates into pensions, delayed retirement age to 63, and limited how much overtime pay could be used to calculate someone's eventual benefits. This year, the public employees won improvements to their pension benefits in Tier 6, which is the tier that most current members are a part of. The reforms vary depending on the type of employee, but notably teachers in the state got their retirement age brought down from 63 to 58, assuming you have 30 years of service. And other public employees saw reductions in contribution rates. The maximum contribution rate is now 5.75%. We also see that there's an increase in how much overtime can be included in benefit calculations, and it takes a shorter amount of time for your pension to vest. Overall, this is going to cost the state, the state and local governments in total $557 million, and $440 million are expected to come from local government, with the remainder coming from the state. The original sort of proposal from the Fixed Tier 6 campaign was $1.5 billion, so this is not a complete meeting of their goals, but it's a significant upgrade to their benefits. Okay, I'm going to pass it to Andrew. Andrew, just so you know, you're muted.
Yes, thank you, Emily. Hey, everybody, I'm Andrew Perry. I'm going to talk about the funding for New York City and then childcare. So, as many people who have been paying attention to FPI's work will note, New York City faced a really substantial fiscal shortfall as Mayor Mamdani stepped into office. The shortfall was really the result of misbudgeting by the prior administration, which had sort of systematically hid or under budgeted costs, especially in education programs and social services, and by sort of depressing what they expected to spend in future years on programs that they were legally required to fund. They created this really acute imbalance for fiscal year 2027. It was among the first sort of big challenges that faced our new mayor. New York State is a really integral part of this problem because New York State authorizes New York City revenue and has pretty substantial control over how New York City spends its own money. So New York State was always going to be a really essential part of the solution to New York City's fiscal crunch. And this budget really does step up support for New York City and is going to help the city close its fiscal year 2027 budget gap. So we see here in this table that total support from the enacted budget will reach about $5.2 billion. It's important to note that this is not all new funding. It's really new funding and authorizing the city to spend less money. So this is $5.2 billion. The number that you should really compare this to in terms of the city's need is $7 billion, because $7 billion was sort of the mayor's identification of the budget gap at the start of the budget process. So the state really did, play a majority of the role in helping the city balance its budget. This consists of some one-time aid, some recurring revenue, and as I mentioned, allowing the city to spend less money. And then finally, one piece of new revenue, the Pied-à-terre tax. And I'm going to take all of these pieces on in turn. So of that $5.2 billion, we're really only getting about $600 million in new recurring spending to the city. The additional new funding is mostly going to be one-off payments or some payments, including the sort of remitting some sales tax revenue to the city that takes place over a couple of years, but then stops. So only $600 million in recurring spending. This is divided between foundation aid. The important changes to the foundation aid formula included in the enacted budget are adding new funding for districts that have populations of homeless students. So right now, there's no additional allocation for districts based on the count of students experiencing homelessness. This adds an additional weight in the formula. So districts that have more students experiencing homelessness will be allocated additional per pupil funding. Obviously, homelessness is a huge problem in New York City, so that increases New York City's allocation. And the other change in the foundation aid formula affecting New York City is that the enacted budget increases the additional funding allocation for English language learners. Previously, English language learners received a 53% funding bump. That means that the state sort of hands out a per pupil grant, and then for every English language learner, they get a 53% bump for each student. And that increase is increased to 60% in in the enacted budget. So taken together, these are pretty considerable steps up in districts that have students experiencing homelessness and students with who are learning the English language. New York City, obviously has large populations of both, and so we're going to get $160 million on a recurring basis out of school aid. The state budget also includes $300 million for youth diversion programs, and another $60 million for public health, and $100 million for sort of another grab bag of items, including death benefits for the families of public servants. So that's the recurring aid to New York City. You'll have noted in my beginning table on the New York City budget that one of really the biggest piece is this issue called pension reamortization. What is the pension reamortization schedule, and why is it so much money? So New York City pre-funds its benefits. New York State but pensions are pre-funded. What pre-funding means is that as we're employing a public servant, we appropriate the amount of money we think that their benefits will cost for the future in each year they're working, so that by the time our public servants retire, New York has accrued and invested enough benefits that those accrued benefits should be sufficient or will be sufficient to fund the retirement benefits for the duration of our public servants' retirements. New York City public pensions are about 87% funded. That means that sort of towards that goal of being pre-funded would be 100%. We're 87% of the way there. That's pretty good. It's better than the national average, which is in the low 60s. The remaining 13% is what this whole issue of pension reamortization is. Starting with the stock market underperformance in the dot-com bust and then the Great Recession, our pension funds had underperformed. New York downgraded its expectation of future pension fund investment performance, and that created this sort of newly recognized need for more pension funds to meet that goal of being 100% pre-funded. To accomplish that goal, the state allowed New York City to reach its pension funding goals over a 25-year amortization schedule. So we're going to meet our pension payments in our sort of newly recognized unfunded pension obligation in these increments, which were set to be fully met in the city's fiscal year 2032. However, there was a sort of bizarre design problem with the original pension amortization schedule, which is that the payments required by that schedule ramp up pretty substantially in the final years of the amortization schedule and then drop off. And they were originally meant to drop to zero in 2032. But because our pension funds have been overperforming, they're actually the payments to the pension funds were actually set to drop below zero, meaning the pension funds would begin returning money back to the city. In effect, this meant that we're sort of forced into this like really intense fiscal pressure for the final years of the amortization schedule, forcing sort of surplus savings, more savings than are actually necessary. And then it's going to open up this sort of windfall of fiscal space in 2032. This is a really bizarre policy design that creates a lot of fiscal pressure right now and for the next 7 years, and then creates this sort of windfall, this fiscal windfall in the future. It would make a lot more sense to smooth out that contribution schedule and sort of wind our way down and not require us to sort of oversave or save more than is needed at a time when the budget is already feeling stressed. It has the effect of just overburdening current taxpayers. And so what the state budget does is it allows the city to reamortize our pension payments, where it recognizes the sort of extra investment returns that have been accrued over the last 2 decades, and it extends the amortization schedule by just 5 years out to 2037. And so what the difference that makes is sort of shown on this orange bar on the chart. I realize that it's not labeled, but the blue bar is the blue line is the original amortization schedule. The orange is the new amortization schedule. And it really opens up substantial fiscal space over the next 7 years out to fiscal year 2032. It's worth noting that this does not affect the actual benefits to which public servants are entitled to. It can't affect the benefits to which public servants are entitled to because those are protected by the New York State Constitution. So it would be sort of impossible for this to affect people's actual benefits or entitlements. What it really is about sort of creating fiscal space now, not overburdening current taxpayers, and smoothing out this sort of bizarre contribution cliff that had been codified by the prior amortization schedule. And that creates pretty substantial fiscal space for the city. That amounts to about $1.6 billion in each out year. And then the final really big piece of the state support for New York City is allowing the city to adopt a pied-à-terre tax. So pied-à-terre tax is a tax on second homes, on any homes that are owned, that are not used as primary residences, that are used as second homes. The pied-à-terre tax is being imposed on all properties that are valued at more than $5 million. And this is estimated to bring in $500 million a year. As negotiations were going on over how we're going to design and implement a pied-à-terre tax, there's this really major concern that the city's property valuations are sort of so inaccurate, especially at the top end of luxury residences, that there's no way that a pied-à-terre tax set at $5 million would be sufficient to bring in $500 million per year. To get around this, the enacted budget phases in the pied-à-terre tax. The phase-in only has administrative uses. It doesn't actually affect revenue, or nominally it should not affect the liability that pied-à-terre owners are subject to. But it starts off by subjecting condos and co-ops to a $1 million market valuation this in the upcoming fiscal year, and then that will rise to that $5 million mark. The reason they're starting at $1 million is because condos and co-ops at the top end are so undervalued that it's pretty clear that a co-op that's valued according to the New York State Department of Finance at $1 million actually has a sales value of about $5 million. So this is really a way for the city to try to hit that $5 million mark immediately, gives us some flexibility, and then we're going to have to come back and really talk about fixing those market valuations. And this will be an issue for the next state budget or even state legislation before the next budget, because part of why New York City's market valuations of luxury condos is so inaccurate are by rules that are codified by state law. So fixing that is really going to be an issue that's going to come back up. But for now, the purpose of the pied-à-terre tax is to give New York City enough flexibility that we should be able to hit the $500 million mark. Whether they do is going to be a big question that FPI is going to pay attention to. So what's next for New York City? The fiscal year 2027 budget will be balanced. However, the mayor's preliminary budget projects a $7 billion out-year gap for fiscal year 2028. Now, it's worth noting that the city always projects out-year budget gaps. This is just a matter of standard fiscal practice. Not only are budget gaps typically closed by higher than expected revenue, but the budget typically grows and the mayor and the council get to add spending priorities. So the existence of a projected budget gap is not a cause for alarm on its own. Nevertheless, $7 billion is a bit on the high end. It's possible that the fiscal year 2028 budget will be tight and that there will not be sort of additional surplus budget growth that's available for new spending priorities. All that makes it clear that implementing the mayor's affordability agenda is very likely to require new revenue, and that revenue will have to be authorized by the state. So we can expect next year to come back and have a conversation about state revenue, or the state authorizing the city revenue. And now I'm going to go through the executive budget, or the enacted budget's childcare plan. I'm going to go through this quickly because the enacted budget does not make any changes from the executive budget. So it's a huge part of the budget, which is why we're covering it. But because there are no major changes, many of you will have heard this before. So there are 1 million children under 5 years old in New York State. Universal childcare means that all of those 1 million children need to have access to free, publicly provided childcare, just like the public school system offers everybody who's over 5 access to education in schools. New York City already has a trio of programs: paid family leave, the child care assistance program, which provides subsidized vouchers that are means tested, and universal pre-kindergarten that collectively provide care for about 250,000 children in New York State. So in this table, we sort of go over where we currently are and what universal childcare will look like. We already have pre-K for 4-year-olds in much of the state, and this budget really consolidates that and makes pre-K for 4-year-olds really universal. It expands 3K for 3-year-olds in New York City substantially, but it doesn't get all the way there outside of New York City. And finally, it launches 2Care in New York City. That's going to be free childcare for 2-year-olds. Doesn't have much for 2-year-olds outside of New York City. And for the youngest children, for under 2s, there's really very little except for more funding for those means-tested vouchers, the Child Care Assistance Program. So the enacted budget is a major step. It's a really historical step towards universal childcare, but there's still considerably farther to go. Here we estimate the current enrollment and changes in the enacted budget by age. As I mentioned, on 4s, we're really much of the way there, and this budget really consolidates that. It makes major progress on 2s, but there's still much more work to be done on younger than 2s and on 2 and 3-year-olds outside of New York City. Once the actions in the executive budget are in the enacted budget are phased in, we expect them to provide care for another 110,000 children in New York State. So that's on top of the 250,000 children who are already provided care by existing programs. Where that leaves us is that there are going to be another 250,000 children who need more care. Those numbers don't add up to 1 million because especially for the youngest children, even if you offer free high quality care, we know that not all parents are going to take that care up. Especially for the youngest kids, many parents prefer informal family, staying at home, etc. So we think that there's another 250,000 children in New York State who will need care after these programs are going to be delivered. What that care is going to look like is going to be expanded paid family leave. That's care for the first year of life. Statewide daycare for under 2s outside of New York City. There's also the issue that preschool right now is not full day or year round, right? Preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds follows the school year, which typically ends at about 2:40 in New York City and takes the summer off. So really, universal childcare is going to provide daycare that should be the length of a working day, and the full year. And finally, the budget does nothing for living wages for childcare workers. The median childcare worker in New York State makes $38,000. That's not a living wage. Bringing childcare workers up to a living wage really needs to be part of a universal childcare program, both because it's the right thing to do by the workers and also because it's unlikely that we're going to actually be able to deliver the supply of childcare seats for those remaining 250,000 children if the wages aren't enough to bring workers into the system, and $38,000 is unlikely to be sufficient to bring workers into the system. So those are the remaining programs that we're going to need. FPI is going to continue to advise on exactly what those are going to look for ahead of next year's budget. And right now, our estimates are that those will all collectively cost $6 billion statewide. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Michael to talk about healthcare.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me just share my screen here. My name is Michael Kanuka, and I'm the Health Policy Director at the Fiscal Policy Institute, and I'm going to give a really, really quick rundown of the main healthcare provisions in the budget. As always, there's a lot of healthcare policy in the state budget, and we won't get to all of it here. But I am giving a technical briefing for people who really want to get into the weeds next week at exactly this time, so Friday at noon next week. And there will be a QR code and an email will go out. So if you want to get into deep healthcare policy, look out for that. So just to sort of set the context of this state budget, right? So prior to in healthcare, right? Prior to the budget, we saw actually very moderate Medicaid growth, Medicaid spending growth over the last year because of declining enrollment in mainstream Medicaid and flat enrollment in long-term care. So we saw a real break from those dynamics. And also, obviously, the major context was really significant federal cuts due to H.R. 1, which passed last summer. The executive budget included significant rate increases for providers and a proposal to cut the essential plan in response to federal cuts to restructure it so it would be preserved for people under 200% of poverty. But the folks above that level would be kicked out, and that threatened healthcare access for 450,000 folks on the essential plan between 200% and 250%. The one houses were broadly similar in prioritizing provider rates and in failing to address the health insurance crisis. But since the one houses passed, a number of changes happened that created a hope that we would be able to preserve insurance access despite federal cuts. The federal government has now approved our plan to maintain the essential plan for the low-income population, and so we only have to cover folks between 200 and 250. And there was a growing legislative interest in addressing essential plan coverage losses. Unfortunately, the enacted budget chose not to address insurance loss for the essential plan population. And what that means for New Yorkers is really short term. There are 450,000 New Yorkers earning up to about $40,000 a year for a single individual are set to lose health insurance in just about a month on July 1st. There has been some spin coming from the governor and the speaker that those folks will find alternative sources of coverage through employers and so forth. But as I've shown in published work, that is not true. The vast majority of these folks will lose access to health insurance. So it's a really, really dramatic, it's the most rapid loss of coverage we've seen in New York State history. The budget also fails to take action to mitigate the impact of Medicaid work requirements. And so we estimate that those work requirements will go into effect on January 1st, and we estimate that over time they'll cause a further 800,000 New Yorkers to lose health insurance. And so this enacted budget really reflects a total lack of interest on the part of the legislature and the governor in actually protecting health insurance. But there is significant spending on healthcare in the form of very significant rate increases for hospitals, for nursing homes, et cetera. And so, I'll just say this graph is something we've been showing for several months now, and sort of showing that over the past 10 years, New York has done a really great job of expanding health insurance access, and now we are likely to see that dynamic go into reverse really, really quickly over the next month and over the next 2 years. And this is the path that we're currently on, based on the enacted budget. So it's a real, tragedy. However, the enacted budget does follow the executives and one houses in providing really, really substantial investments in provider rate increases under Medicaid. So these figures are all funds, so they include both state and federal funds. But between state and federal funds, we're seeing an additional $2 billion to providers in the Medicaid rates. Most of that money goes to hospitals in the form of substantial rate increases. Hospital quality pool, whose political goal is unclear, and other stuff. Nursing homes also see about $500 million. FQHCs are set to receive $80 million. And then mental hygiene providers under OMH, OASAS, and so forth, are set to see a 2.7% rate increase, which is ideally targeted to go to their workforce at $280 million. And so overall, we're talking about a $2 billion investment. So I want to emphasize this is not a situation where policymakers faced with federal cuts were sort of forced to squeeze the Medicaid budget. Instead, it's a situation where the Medicaid budget is actually likely to grow substantially despite flat enrollment on the basis of provider rate increases. But despite that, we're likely to see a massive health insurance loss. In terms of funding specifically for safety net providers who are set to be hard hit by HR 1 as it phases in fully, what we're seeing is essentially a flat budget. So safety net funding will remain the same as it did last year. That's better than the executive budget, which cut $500 million from a program called VAPAP that supports safety nets. But it isn't a substantial increase. And so we're seeing overall rate increases, but not a lot of money targeted specifically to safety net providers. And that doesn't set us up for success in the long term necessarily, because as HR 1 is fully phased in, we're going to see cuts to New York's main safety net funding program, the so-called DPT, or Directed Payment Template funding, due to start in fiscal year 28. So we're still looking at a real reckoning on the ability of safety net hospitals to keep their doors open after this budget. In terms of how all of this was funded, it was largely funded out of sort of general revenues. The state experienced strong revenue growth, but there is a new specific tax that is set to go into effect. This is being described as a modification of the MCO tax, which was enacted in 2024 and then was banned by HR 1. The original MCO tax was really sort of a complicated financial maneuver to get more federal money for through the Medicaid program. So it wasn't really a tax on New Yorkers. It was sort of a mechanism to tax and then spend back into the Medicaid program to generate increased federal match. The new MCO tax is smaller, but it's also quite a bit different, because the original mechanism was banned by HR 1. The new MCO tax is just straightforwardly a tax on insurance premiums. It's 0.35% premium tax, which will slightly increase the cost of health insurance for everyone who purchases health insurance in New York. So employers, people on the individual market. I want to keep this in context. It is small in a state where insurance premiums rise 6 or 7% year over year and have done so for decades. A 0.35% premium tax is not going to break the bank, but it is notable that we are sort of funding Medicaid rate increases out of a tax on private insurance, even as we cut people off from the essential plan and Medicaid and ask them to go try to buy insurance in the private market. And that's set to raise $165 million. So not a huge amount of money relative to Medicaid. In terms of healthcare policy, there were a number of wins for when I say providers, I mostly mean the hospital industry, although not exclusively. The state continued its various subsidies for provider malpractice insurance, which are sort of regularly cut back in the executive and then restored by the legislature. That happened again this year. The governor had also proposed newly this year a significant reform to New York State's No Surprises Act, which has been generating really, really high payments to providers and has been abused by some unscrupulous providers. That idea or reform, as proposed by the governor, would have applied to the whole state-regulated insurance market. It was significantly pared back. So now it applies only to NISHIP and Medicaid to state-paid insurance, and was also restricted in various other ways. And again, there's a bunch of this that I'll discuss in the technical briefing. Ditto. There were a handful of advocacy wins. For instance, a longstanding healthcare advocate sort of desire is that school-based health centers that are funded by Medicaid not be subjected to managed care, which is a model that would have caused significant issues for them and likely caused some of them to close. School-based health centers are now permanently carved out of managed care. We've been sort of kicking the can on it for years, and now we now have a permanent carve-out, which is really exciting. I mentioned this on the slide about provider funding, but there's a substantial rate increase for mental health that is ideally supposed to go to the mental health workforce. The executive had proposed a 1.7% increase. The Enacted has a 2.7%. That's about $280 million. The executive proposed, and it was enacted, that state-regulated insurance will now be required to cover gambling addiction treatment. That's a really good idea. If, as a society, we've decided to legalize gambling, that causes significant psychiatric and financial distress, and it's good to see action on it. Unfortunately, the enacted budget does not fund gender-affirming care, and so please call your legislators to encourage them to pass A6596 by the end of the session to do that. There's also no action on drug pricing. There were a couple of proposals for public drug production or for price regulation floating around before the budget. They're not in there. And so what we're seeing is a really expanded healthcare budget, but a clear policy choice to sort of walk away from New York's long commitment to move toward universal health insurance coverage and to allow 1 million New Yorkers, roughly 5% of the state, to lose health insurance starting a month from now and continuing over the next couple of years. And there's also a continued failure to address private sector employer-sponsored insurance affordability. Although the Fair Pricing Act, which FPI supports, does have potential to move after after the budget. So I'll just say, zooming out and then move to questions. New York is facing a double-sided health insurance access crisis, where at the same time we're seeing our public sources of health insurance like EP and Medicaid cut back dramatically. We're also seeing an explosion of private sector healthcare costs. And so people really have nowhere to turn. If you get kicked off the essential plan, you're faced with a really dysfunctional and inflationary private market. We're seeing employer-sponsored plans that are either being cut back or are at a $5,000 deductible and sort of totally inadequate. And addressing these crises, is going to have to include action on both fronts. So restoration of the essential plan or a similar program to provide insurance for low-income people, and then much stronger regulation of healthcare costs and especially hospital and drug prices if we expect to rein in the cost of insurance. And despite references to affordability in Albany this year, neither of those goals has really been taken up, and so we're looking at a really challenging future. So that's it, and then I'll move to questions, and anyone can ask questions of any of the panelists, not just me.
Awesome. I'll moderate the question and answer session. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A right now. So I noticed that there's a lot of questions for Andrew about childcare. I just want to, maybe Andrew, I assume you've read through some of these and can take them in turn, but I think the first that I'd like you to answer is, does the expansion in the 2-year-olds that you showed in a chart, is that because of the voucher program, or
The expansion in 2-year-olds, it really assumes the full phase in of 2K in New York City. So, and it includes vouchers. So I factor both of those in, but the main effect is going to be the phase in of 2Care, which is supposed to happen over the next 4 years. Right, this is only year one, so that's that effect.
Okay.
I think I have another couple of questions about childcare for children with disabilities. Mm-hmm. So right now, the main mechanism for childcare for children with disabilities is the Child Care Assistance Program. Those means-tested vouchers I mentioned have this sort of increased supplemental rate for children with disabilities, meaning providers who provide care for disabilities, for children who have those vouchers, who have a disability, get a 15% bump in the rate that the voucher reimburses them. There's been work done by the Children's Agenda, and I'm happy to share their research that shows that that's really not adequate and it lags behind other states. So this is really an area in which New York comes up short, and this budget does nothing to address that. So that's going to remain a shortcoming of the New York system.
Okay. I thought there had been a question about whether the funding for childcare was baselined into the budget. Did you already answer that?
Yes, I answered that, but I'm happy to do it live because it's a good question. Because the answer is yes. The childcare plan presented by the budget seems to be baseline, meaning it's projected forward in future fiscal years. That is not sort of binding at all, right? There's no law that says that those are that's committed funding. It's just a financial plan that's put out by the governor. It's nothing more than that. It does appear to be baked into those future plans. However, the financial plan is actually extraordinarily opaque. It's more opaque than it normally is, even about the actual funding plan for its own childcare agenda. So it's really hard to sort of disentangle what they are projecting for increased care costs as that program phases in, what's projected in any growth for CCAP. Um, those are just completely opaque in the financial plan. But as a baseline, yes, the answer is that it is projected forward.
Okay. Just while Andrew, you're answering questions, could you respond to the class size mandate and how that sort of
Yes, it's a good point that the class size mandate was actually not enacted in the budget. Um, it's been published, or it's been reported that John Liu says that we're going to debate it after in session after the budget. Um, the governor and the mayor are taking it to the bank, so that's why I included it without even sort of noting that, although possibly it should have been noted. But yeah, it's a good point that that's going to have to be enacted after the budget. Um,
Okay.
There's one more question I want to tackle actually while I'm looking at the list is about the school vouchers enacted by the OBBBA. This is not so the OBBBA, the Republican tax cuts, passed this new federal tax credit for donations to private schools that can then be sort of converted into credits, tuition credits for attending those. So it's sort of a sneaky way of just voucherizing the public school system through the federal tax code. States have to opt into it. This was not addressed in the budget at all. It doesn't affect state revenue because it affects federal revenue. And the budget doesn't make any move to conform or opt into the federal program. However, it's been reported that Kathy Hochul intends to opt into it. So yeah, this is definitely going to be a huge education finance issue in the months ahead. So that's a great question.
But is it correct that it's not actually part of the budget?
It is not part of the budget.
Let's move to some Michael questions. Michael, could you speak to, maybe you could speak a little bit about, speculate on the reasons for not covering the essential plan enrollees that are about to lose coverage?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there were a number of determinants of that. One of them is clearly that Governor Hochul and other policymakers in Albany believe that voters will hold Republicans accountable rather than holding them accountable for healthcare coverage losses. So, there's a political accountability issue. I also think that the essential plan is a really, really strong policy tool for covering people very efficiently. But part of the way it does that is by regulating the rates paid to providers. The essential plan pays almost 2.5 times as much as Medicaid, but still less than very, very high commercial insurance prices. And I think there's a lack of interest among providers potentially in sort of seeing that very successful model continue to expand. I think policymakers have, frankly, a very outdated and confused commitment to the idea of private employer-sponsored insurance. Unfortunately, private employer-sponsored insurance in New York continues to really become dramatically worse and more expensive every single year. And so, I think there is this sort of belief that people maybe can get back on an employer plan that is really not grounded in the reality of today's health insurance market.
Do you want to speak a little bit to the New York Health Act?
Yeah, I think this enormous crisis in health insurance access is making a lot of people think big about how do we actually sort of address this problem once and for all. The New York Health Act is a bill that would save New Yorkers a lot of money by moving to a Canada-style sort of single-payer healthcare system at the state level. I think it's a really exciting idea. I will just say that, one of the open questions about the New York Health Act is whether the political will to exists to do it. Many legislators sort of co-sponsor it, but don't seem to do a lot of work on it. I would say a legislature and a governor that lack the political will to protect the health insurance coverage that we have for, the 450,000 New Yorkers who are about to lose coverage on July 1st is unlikely to have the political will to go much farther in the direction of the New York Health Act. And so, I think it speaks to the need to just sort of continuing to work to insist that healthcare is a human right.
Okay. There's a couple other things, but I'm not sure they're really questions. I think since it's exactly 1 p.m. right now, we'll end here. If you have further questions, please feel free to email us info@fiscalpolicy.org. And what's on the screen right now is the QR code that should take you to be able to sign up for Michael's technical briefing on June 5th at 12 p.m. If it doesn't work, we will also be sending out an email very soon with a link that should work. And with that, thanks everyone for coming. And we will post these slides in the video and send an email with them when they're ready. Thanks everyone.